The New Mexico territory stretched endlessly under the September moon, a landscape of silver sand and black shadows that had witnessed countless stories of survival, loss, and the strange meetings that changed lives in ways no one could predict. Robert McKenna guided his horse along the ancient trail that wound through the desert toward his isolated ranch. Tired from 3 days in Santa Fe conducting business he would rather have avoided, but could not afford to ignore. At 39 years old, Robert had spent the last 8 years building the Sunset Mesa Ranch from nothing more than determination and the inheritance left by a father who had died believing his son would never amount to anything worthwhile. The ranch sat in a natural basin surrounded by red rock formations that provided protection from wind and concealment from the Apache war parties that still occasionally swept through the territory, despite official claims that the Indian conflicts had ended. Robert had chosen isolation deliberately after losing his wife Sarah and their infant daughter to cholera during the epidemic that had swept through Denver 5 years earlier. The grief had nearly destroyed him, and only the demanding work of building a ranch in hostile territory had provided enough distraction to keep him from following them into whatever lay beyond the veil of death. Now he lived alone, except for his horses and cattle, finding purpose in the simple rhythms of survival and the satisfaction of creating something lasting in a land that seemed determined to destroy everything humans tried to build. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to make night travel possible for someone who knew the trail well, when Robert first noticed the shadow moving parallel to his path about 50 yards to the south. At first he thought it might be a coyote, or perhaps one of the wild mustangs that sometimes followed travelers out of curiosity, but something about the movement was too purposeful, too deliberate for an animal. Drawing his horse to a halt, Robert studied the shadow more carefully and felt his blood chill as he realized what he was seeing. It was a human figure, moving on foot with the silent grace that marked the Apache people, keeping pace with his horse despite the difficult terrain and the punishing pace he had maintained since leaving Santa Fe at sunset. Robert's hand moved instinctively to the rifle secured in his saddle scabbard, though he made no aggressive moves that might provoke an attack. The Apache Wars had supposedly ended with the surrender of Geronimo 3 years earlier, but scattered bands still roamed the territory, and encounters between whites and natives often ended in violence, regardless of anyone's peaceful intentions. The shadow stopped when he stopped, maintaining the same distance and apparently content to simply observe rather than approach. For several minutes they remained motionless, 2 figures frozen in a tableau of mutual wariness under the desert stars. Then Robert made a decision that surprised even himself. "I am not your enemy," he called across the space between them, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I seek only to return to my home in peace." There was no response, but the shadow seemed to shift slightly, as if whoever was hidden there was considering his words and weighing their sincerity. Robert waited, understanding that patience was often more valuable than force when dealing with people who had learned to survive by trusting no one. When several more minutes passed without any sign of hostility, Robert urged his horse forward at a slow walk, making no attempt to close the distance between himself and the mysterious figure, but simply continuing his journey toward home. The shadow resumed its parallel movement, maintaining the same spacing and the same cautious pace. For the next hour, they traveled together in this strange formation, the mounted man and the walking figure following the ancient trail that had been used by traders, warriors, and wanderers for centuries before either of them was born. Robert found himself oddly comforted by the presence of another human being, even one who might represent potential danger, after 3 days of conducting business among people who saw him only as a source of profit or competition. It was near midnight when the moon moved behind a bank of clouds, plunging the desert into darkness so complete that Robert could no longer see his companion's shadow. He reined in his horse and listened carefully, hearing only the night sounds of the desert and the soft breathing of his mount. For a moment, he thought the mysterious traveler had used the darkness to disappear entirely, melting back into the landscape from which they had emerged. Then he heard a sound that made his heart clench with unexpected emotion, the soft whimper of someone in pain, followed by what sounded like a stifled sob. It was clearly a young voice, possibly that of a child or teenager, and it spoke of suffering that went beyond mere physical discomfort. "Are you hurt?" Robert called into the darkness, abandoning caution in favor of concern for someone who was obviously in distress. This time, there was a response, though it came in Apache rather than English. The voice was definitely that of a young woman, and while Robert could not understand her words, the tone conveyed a mixture of pain, exhaustion, and wariness that needed no translation. Robert dismounted and lit the small lantern he carried for emergencies, casting a circle of yellow light that revealed the desert around him, but not the location of the voice. "I cannot see you," he said gently. "But if you are injured, I might be able to help." A longer silence followed, and Robert could almost feel the internal struggle taking place in the darkness beyond his lantern's reach. Trust was a luxury that Apache people could rarely afford in a territory where their presence was often met with violence, but survival sometimes required accepting help from unexpected sources. Finally, a figure emerged from behind a cluster of barrel cacti 20 feet from where Robert stood. It was indeed a young Apache woman, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, with long black hair braided with strips of colored cloth and wearing the traditional dress of her people. But what struck Robert most forcefully was her condition. She was clearly exhausted, dehydrated, and favoring her left leg in a way that suggested injury. More disturbing still was the evidence of recent violence. Her clothing was torn and stained with what appeared to be blood, both dried and fresh. Scratches and bruises marked her arms and face, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had witnessed something too terrible to process fully. "My God," Robert breathed, taking a step toward her before stopping when she immediately backed away. "What happened to you?" The young woman studied him with the intense scrutiny of someone who had learned that survival often depended on accurately reading the intentions of strangers. Whatever she saw in his face and posture seemed to satisfy some internal test, because she spoke again, this time mixing Apache words with broken English. "Soldiers," she said, the word carrying a weight of hatred and fear that needed no elaboration. "They come to canyon where my family hide. Kill grandfather, uncle, little brother. Take others to reservation. I run, but they follow. Shot my horse. Chase me 2 days." The story explained her condition and her presence on the trail, but it also created a dangerous situation for Robert. Harboring a fugitive Apache, especially one who had fled from military custody, could result in serious legal consequences and possible retaliation from both civil and military authorities. But looking at this injured young woman who had somehow survived 2 days of pursuit across hostile desert, Robert found that legal considerations mattered less than simple human decency. Whatever had happened in that canyon, whatever violence had scattered her family and left her alone in the wilderness, she was now just a frightened girl who needed help. "What is your name?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. "Ayana," she replied, pronouncing it with the musical cadence of her native language. "Means eternal blossom. I am Robert McKenna. My ranch is not far from here, perhaps 2 hours' ride. You can rest there, tend your wounds, decide what you want to do next." Ayana's eyes widened with surprise. "You help Apache, girl? Soldiers say all white men hate Apache, want us dead, or on reservation. Some white men think that way," Robert admitted. "But not all. I judge people by their actions, not by their ancestry. And right now, I see someone who needs help. Why? Why you risk trouble to help enemy?" Robert considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer might determine whether she trusted him enough to accept his assistance. "Because I have lost family too," he said finally. "I know what it feels like to be alone in the world, to have everything you cared about taken away by forces beyond your control. No one should have to face that kind of pain without help." Something in his voice, some echo of shared grief, seemed to reach Ayana in a way that mere words could not. Her defensive posture relaxed slightly, though she remained ready to flee if his behavior suggested deception or threat. "Your family, they die in war?" she asked. "They died of sickness," Robert replied. "My wife and baby daughter. 3 years ago now, but sometimes it feels like yesterday." Ayana nodded, with the understanding of someone who had learned that grief was a universal language that transcended cultural boundaries. "Apache believe spirits of dead watch over living, guide them to help when needed. Maybe your family spirits bring you to me tonight." It was a beautiful thought that offered comfort Robert had not expected to find in this strange midnight encounter. Maybe they did. he agreed. In which case, I should listen to their guidance. The journey to Robert's ranch took longer than usual due to Ayanna's injured leg and the need to stop frequently for rest. She rode behind him on his horse, her arms around his waist for balance, maintaining the kind of physical contact that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances between strangers of different cultures. But these were not normal circumstances, and survival created its own rules that superseded social conventions. During their slow progress across the desert, Ayanna gradually shared more details about the attack that had scattered her family. Her band had been hiding in a remote canyon, trying to avoid the reservations where Apache people were confined like prisoners and forced to abandon their traditional way of life. They had lived peacefully, hunting small game and gathering desert plants, bothering no one and asking only to be left alone. The soldiers had come at dawn, claiming they were acting on reports of stolen cattle and missing supplies, though Ayanna insisted her people had taken nothing that did not belong to them. The confrontation had escalated quickly, with nervous young soldiers opening fire when an old man had refused to surrender a sacred medicine bundle that had been in his family for generations. "They kill him for a piece of leather and feathers," Ayanna said, her voice heavy with grief and anger. "Say it proof we steal from white settlers, but grandfather never take anything from anyone. Bundle hold prayers of his father's father, sacred thing, not stolen thing." Robert listened to her story with growing anger at the senseless violence that had destroyed a family and scattered the survivors to face uncertain fates on reservations or in the wilderness. He had served briefly in the territorial militia and understood that military actions were often driven more by political pressure than actual threats, with devastating consequences for people caught in the crossfire. The Sunset Mesa Ranch appeared in the distance as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, its buildings silhouetted against the red rock formations that had given the property its name. Robert felt an unexpected sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with the familiar landscape, and everything to do with the fact that he was no longer arriving alone. Ayanna stared at the ranch buildings with obvious amazement. The main house was built of adobe and stone, designed to stay cool in summer and warm in winter, with a deep porch that provided shade during the hottest part of the day. Outbuildings included a barn, corrals, a smokehouse, and a workshop where Robert crafted the tools and equipment needed for ranch operation. It was modest by the standards of established settlements, but it represented prosperity and permanence in a land where both were difficult to achieve. "You build all this alone?" Ayanna asked as they approached the main house. "Most of it," Robert confirmed. "It has taken 8 years, and there is still work to be done, but it serves my needs." "Is big for one person. You not lonely living here alone?" The question struck closer to home than Robert was prepared to admit. "Sometimes," he acknowledged, "but loneliness seemed preferable to the complications that come with depending on other people." Ayanna was quiet for a moment, then said something that revealed wisdom beyond her years. "Apache believe person who live alone too long forget how to live with others. Heart become like desert in dry season, hard and empty. Need rain of friendship to bloom again." It was an observation that contained more truth than Robert was comfortable confronting, but he was saved from having to respond by their arrival at the house. He helped Ayanna down from the horse and supported her as she limped toward the porch, noting how she favored her injured leg and the way exhaustion made her movements increasingly unsteady. Inside the house, Robert lit lamps and stoked the fire while Ayanna examined her surroundings with the careful attention of someone who needed to understand every potential escape route and hiding place. The main room was simply furnished but comfortable, with handmade furniture and a few personal items that spoke of a man who valued function over decoration. "Sit here by the fire," Robert instructed, indicating a chair with soft cushions that would be easier on her injured leg. "I will get water for washing and supplies to tend your wounds." As he gathered medical supplies and heated water, Robert found himself wondering what he had gotten himself into. Providing temporary shelter to an injured traveler was one thing, but harboring a fugitive Apache could bring serious consequences if discovered by authorities. More concerning was his growing awareness that Ayanna's presence was awakening feelings he had thought buried with his wife and daughter. When he returned with clean water and bandages, he found Ayanna examining a photograph that sat on the mantelpiece, a formal portrait of Robert with Sarah and their infant daughter. taken just months before the cholera epidemic that had claimed their lives. "Your family," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of recognition. "Yes, Sarah and little Mary. They died when Mary was only 6 months old." Ayanna studied the photograph with the intense attention of someone who understood the weight of loss. They were beautiful. Sarah, she looked kind. Mary, she looked like you. "She did," Robert agreed, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came with talking about his lost family. "She had my eyes, but her mother's smile." Apache believe children who die young become stars to guide their parents. Maybe your Mary still watch over you, help you make good choices. It was another beautiful thought that offered unexpected comfort. Robert had spent 3 years trying to forget his daughter rather than find ways to honor her memory. But Ayanna's perspective suggested a different approach to grief that might be more healing than his determined isolation. "Let me see to your wounds," he said, changing the subject before his emotions overwhelmed his composure. Treating Ayanna's injuries required a level of intimacy that would have been scandalous under normal social circumstances, but medical necessity created its own propriety. Robert cleaned and bandaged cuts on her arms and legs, applied salve to bruises and scratches, and fashioned a support for her injured ankle that would allow her to walk without putting too much weight on it. Throughout the process, Ayanna endured the discomfort without complaint, though Robert could see her struggle to remain conscious as exhaustion and pain took their toll. When he had finished, she looked at him with gratitude that went far beyond mere politeness. "You have gentle hands for man who live alone," she observed. "Sarah, she teach you to care for sick. She was a teacher before we married," Robert explained. "She believed everyone should know basic medical skills because doctors were scarce on the frontier. She taught me to clean wounds, set bones, recognize signs of serious illness. Good woman, smart woman. You lucky to have love like that, even for short time." "I thought I was cursed to lose them so young," Robert admitted. "But you may be right that I was lucky to have loved them at all." By the time the sun was fully up, Ayanna was sleeping peacefully in the spare bedroom that had been intended for guests who never came. Robert sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the familiar landscape take shape in the morning light and trying to understand how his life had changed so dramatically in the space of a single night. The sensible thing would be to send Ayanna on her way as soon as she was strong enough to travel, perhaps with supplies and directions to the Mexican border where she might find safety among other Apache refugees. But Robert found himself reluctant to consider such a separation, not just because of concern for her safety, but because her presence had awakened something in him that he had thought permanently dead. For the first time in 3 years, his house felt like a home rather than a shelter. The silence that had been his companion for so long now seemed oppressive rather than peaceful. The routines that had sustained him through the worst of his grief now felt empty and mechanical. Ayanna had been in his life for less than 12 hours, but already he could not imagine returning to the solitude that had once seemed like salvation. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his introspection, and Robert's mood darkened as he recognized the blue uniforms of a cavalry patrol. 4 soldiers led by a young lieutenant were riding hard toward his ranch, and their purposeful approach suggested they were not making a social call. Robert stood and moved to a position where he could block the view into his house, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether his decision to help Ayanna had been an act of compassion or a disaster that would destroy them both. Lieutenant Harrison dismounted and approached the porch with the brisk efficiency of a professional soldier conducting official business. "Mr. McKenna, I am Lieutenant Harrison, 2nd Cavalry. We are searching for an Apache fugitive who escaped from military custody 2 days ago. Have you seen any sign of Indian activity in this area?" "What kind of activity are you referring to, Lieutenant?" Robert asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "A young Apache woman fled during a relocation operation. She is considered dangerous and may be carrying stolen property. Any assistance you can provide in locating her would be appreciated by the territorial government." Robert considered his options carefully. A direct lie would be difficult to maintain if the soldiers decided to search his property, but the truth would almost certainly result in Ayanna's arrest and his own prosecution for harboring a fugitive. "I encountered no dangerous Indians on my return from Santa Fe," he said, choosing his words with legal precision. The trail was quiet, and I saw nothing that threatened the safety of law-abiding citizens. Lieutenant Harrison studied Robert's face with the suspicious attention of someone trained to detect deception. "Mr. McKenna, I should inform you that harboring fugitive Indians is a federal crime punishable by imprisonment. If you have any knowledge of this woman's whereabouts, it would be in your best interest to share that information. Lieutenant, I understand your duty, and I respect the law, but I have told you the truth about my journey home. I saw nothing that would interest military authorities." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with the soldiers clearly wanting to search the property, but lacking sufficient legal justification to do so without the owner's permission. Finally, Lieutenant Harrison made a decision that suggested he was more interested in completing his patrol than conducting a thorough investigation. "Very well, Mr. McKenna, but we will be maintaining patrols in this area, and any suspicious activity should be reported immediately to military authorities in Santa Fe." After the soldiers had departed, Robert found Ayanna sitting in his kitchen, having obviously overheard the entire conversation from her hiding place. Her expression was a mixture of gratitude and concern that suggested she understood both the protection he had provided and the risk he had assumed on her behalf. "You lie to soldiers for me," she said simply. "Why you do this thing? Now you criminal like me. Because sending you back to face military justice would not be justice at all," Robert replied. "And because I have discovered that some things are more important than following unjust laws." "What happened now?" "Soldiers come back. Search house. Find me here?" Robert had been considering the same question, and he had reached a conclusion that surprised him with its clarity and certainty. "Then we make sure they do not find you. Or we make sure that when they do find you, your presence here is completely legal and legitimate." Ayanna looked at him with confusion. "How we do that?" "By making you my wife," Robert said, the words emerging before he had fully considered their implications. A married woman living on her husband's property with his protection would not be subject to military arrest for refusing to go to a reservation. The proposal hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Robert could hardly believe he had spoken the words. But now that they were out, he realized they represented the only solution that would provide Ayanna with permanent safety while allowing him to live with his conscience. "You want marry Apache girl you know one day?" Ayanna asked, her voice carefully controlled, but her eyes showing the impact of his unexpected offer. "I want to protect someone who has suffered enough," Robert replied. "I want to give you the legal status that will keep you safe from anyone who might try to harm you. And if I am being completely honest, I want the companionship of someone who understands loss and survival and the courage it takes to build something new from the ashes of the old." Ayanna was quiet for a long time, weighing an offer that would solve her immediate problems, but bind her to a life she had never imagined. Finally, she spoke with the practical wisdom that had kept her alive through circumstances that would have destroyed someone with less inner strength. "You good man, Robert McKenna. Kind heart, gentle hands, strong enough to stand against soldiers for stranger. But marriage not just protection. Marriage means sharing life, sharing bed, sharing dreams. You ready for that with Apache girl?" "Are you?" Robert countered. "Ready to share your life with a white rancher who lives alone in the desert and talks to ghosts of dead family?" Ayanna smiled for the first time since he had met her, an expression that transformed her face and revealed the beauty that grief and exhaustion had hidden. "Maybe we both ready for something different than being alone." They were married the next week by a circuit judge who asked no questions about Ayanna's background and seemed pleased to officiate at a ceremony that demonstrated successful integration between cultures that were usually at war. The legal documents identified her as Anna McKenna, wife of Robert McKenna, with full rights and protections under territorial law. The transformation from fugitive Apache to legally protected ranch wife was more than just a change in status. It was a rebirth that allowed Ayanna to claim an identity that honored both her heritage and her new circumstances. She learned to manage the domestic aspects of ranch life while maintaining the traditional skills that connected her to her Apache roots. She brought to their marriage a perspective on survival and adaptation that enriched Robert's understanding of what it meant to truly live, rather than merely exist. Most importantly, They discovered that their marriage of convenience was evolving into something deeper and more meaningful than either had dared to hope. Love grew slowly between them, built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than romantic passion, but it was strong enough to sustain them through the challenges that came with building a life across cultural boundaries. Years later, when they had children of their own, and the Sunset Mesa Ranch had become known throughout the territory as a place where people of all backgrounds could find fair treatment and honest work, Robert would sometimes think about that night when he had first seen a shadow moving beside the trail. It had taken him 8 years of solitude to understand that some encounters were not accidents but destiny, that some shadows were not threats but salvation, and that sometimes the greatest adventures began not with dramatic declarations, but with simple decisions to ride beside someone until the sun came up.